we have three primary missions that are represented on this slide. The first one is we are the nation's resource for nuclear energy technology. We're supposed to know all things about how nuclear energy is generated. That's 1/3 of us. The other third is in that middle picture, and it's about green energy, which includes both, as you can see, things such as wind and solar. And it also includes battery systems. How does this energy get stored? And battery systems now are really cyber systems. They're really cyber physical systems because they have controllers and inverters, and they're hooked up to the internet. So, and then the third one is meant to be a control room. And why that's there is that represents the third division of Idaho National Laboratory, which is National Homeland and Security. And we have the responsibility to be the government's source for protecting critical infrastructure, with respect to electrical generation, how it's distributed, and we also do a lot of work in wireless systems. And in case you ever get to Idaho, I will say that Idaho National Laboratory is easy to find because it's the size of Rhode Island. So it's not exactly small. And it's also the only place I know where you can say turn right after the second nuclear reactor. And soon we will be able to say turn right after the third nuclear reactor. So as a way of introduction, I wanted to start with two things the government issued. This one was issued back in April 20th of 2022. And it basically says Russian attacks on critical infrastructure. And this was in direct response to some, I believe, attacks on water supply systems. And a lot of this also came out of the fact that, we all know what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And what's interesting about this is a couple things. It was a multinational alert from the United States. It came from three areas: CISA, the Cyber Security Infrastructure Agency, the NSA, and the Justice Department, which really means the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I believe, here. And it was also international. It was with our four partners, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and Canada. But what's interesting to do is to look at the recommendations. Okay, what should you do? Patch all systems, enforce multi-factor authentication, secure and monitor remote desktop protocol. So now this is the level at which our systems are getting attacked. Okay? And in all fairness, this is supposed to be a very tactical type alert. Okay? And even if we look 2 years later, in May of this year, we end up talking about defending operational technology, operations against pro-Russia hacktivist activity. And I think one of the things you should understand here is these are not hacktivists like the US has hacktivists. When you see a Russian hacktivist, it's really part of the Russian government. This is the way they do stuff in the world, are through these hacking type organizations. So this is really just an arm of the Russian government, essentially. And this too was a multinational alert, but it's expanded. It now includes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and the FDA. And it was still international. And what are its recommendations? Well, change all default passwords of OT devices. Limit exposure of OT systems to the internet, which I guess means don't hook them to the internet, or maybe put firewalls there, and implement multi-factor authentication. Okay? So as I said, you could think of these as being tactical, but I think the question this raises is what should we be doing for today in order to protect ourselves for tomorrow? And I think we all at least have thoughts of what the answers are, because that's why we're all sitting here. That's why we're all interested in SEL4. And so I think we have some ideas of where we're going. And I have to give credit to Boyd's last talk last night, the last talk of the session last night, because Boyd really set the stage about how things are changing. And our systems just are not being engineered and developed in a way that is really in line with the way the world is changing. And that's one of the things that we've been thinking about and we've been working with Creighton on, and that's what I want to talk about today. And it's better to look not at what I just showed you, because that kind of shows the way it is today, but the way the government, the U.S. government wants it to be are in these various policy documents. And some of these you've seen, but look at what they basically call out. Oh, I'm not going to be able to read this. Enhancing modeling capabilities to determine potential impacts on critical infrastructure of an incident or threat scenario, as well as cascading effects on other sectors. We heard Darren talk about AADL and the way that that's getting incorporated into SysML. So that is along these lines. You want industrial control systems to perform within threshold under duress, meaning when they're attacked. When you look at the 2023, the goal is to have defensible, resilient ecosystems where neither incidents nor errors cascade into catastrophic system consequences. And it's to build a new generation of interconnected hardware and software systems that have the potential to strengthen the resiliency, safety, and efficacy of the U.S. electrical grid. And then the final one is also the report that Darren mentioned in his plenary talk yesterday. It was the one that called using memory-safe languages. And that's what that largely says, but it's also, as Darren said, it called out use formal methods to make sure you're building things that are correct. And I'd like to point out one more thing. This is that same last 2024 that called out for using Rust. It said that the way to go forward is basically with government initiative, private sector invocation, and groundbreaking academic research. We embrace all three of those at INL, and I will say that if it wasn't for our relationship with Crichton, we would not be able to do what we're doing today. We have found this relationship to be very valuable, and for us to duplicate what Crichton, I won't say gives us, but works with us on, would be a step too far for us to do. Yes? That's because I have to be able to see. That's because I have to be able to read. And so let's talk about now what we're going to, the subject matter of this. This is one of the motivation we have, and this is actually a mission that we do have at INL that I'm going to explain. So you have some electrical generation, the operational technology, and a lot of the cyber sits on their own CPU. And INL does have a program where we are asked by the government to monitor certain power stations and certain large facilities of critical infrastructure for basically what's happening in that facility. And one of the problems that arises from that is power stations are private property. They're owned by corporations. They're not government resources. And so that relationship between the government monitoring something that's in private hands is not the easiest thing to always carry out. And so the architecture that allows you to do that is basically a data diode. That looks backwards. Basically, information should only be able to flow from the OT device to the monitor, and nothing should be able to flow from the monitor back to the OT device. And that should be reversed. It doesn't. The symbol should be reversed. Is it right? Oh, you're right. You're right. I guess it's just the way I'm looking at it. Thank you. And literally, that is a physical device that you put in a wire that literally does not let bits go over, does not only let bits go between those two devices in one way. And why that's important, or what we thought about is, well, you would never be able to have lawyers agree to put monitors into someone else's equipment running on the same CPU. But what's interesting with SEL4 is that you can imagine architectures where that one-way flow of information is done by the microkernel, and because it's in SEL4, it has a level of proof that is higher than in any other system. So you start to end up with the fact that you can now think about having embedded monitors on the same CPU if you can provide some form of guarantee as to the correctness of that flow of information. And why that starts to become interesting is not so much for this application, but for the world that we're moving into. And it's this. This is what we basically do now, except for it doesn't run on SEL4. But if something bad happens, the only feedback loop is to go through a person. Basically, you have to write down, some report says what happened. That report goes to a person, and it eventually goes back to the owner of, or the corporation that runs the power supply, the power source, the power plant. And that's not exactly a fast loop, okay? And because it's not a fast loop, it's not really very responsive for the types of attacks we're going to be seeing in the future, and we may even be seeing now. And I think we all can see that the challenge with cyber-physical systems versus IT systems is that if they are attacked, there can be physical damage, and it can even take out these power plants. And so so this is basically a monitor and report type system. And what we saw really enabled by an SEL4 type architecture is that you could imagine that there's a safe capability that could shut down a power plant if it's a type of attack that would end up in physical destruction. And now you can start to get into the idea that if something bad happens, there can be a relatively quick turnaround loop such that appropriate action could be taken, and it wouldn't really have to have the intervention of a human necessarily, and the slowness that a human has imparts on the system. So what you end up with are systems that could be more real-time and more reactive systems. And given, as Boyd described, much of the way the world is evolving, we're going to need these types of systems. And you're going to have to build them on something like SEL4 if you want them to have the properties that you expect them to have. So, and this is the outline of the talk. We want to talk about the idea, the way we try to capture some of these ideas is in this assured reserve mode architecture, or something that we just called ARMA. And I think a lot of you have seen it. Our experimental platform for a lot of this work has been the Fisher technique that's in the back of the room. And when we look at these problems, they really break into two large classes of problems. One is what we call the brownfields problems, which just means you have existing power plants, you can't exactly rebuild them, and if you can't rebuild them, you have to figure out what you're going to do with them. And when I turn it over to Ihor, he's going to talk about the work of this ARMA architecture to have a secure gateway. And then you also have the greenfields, which are new builds, provides additional opportunities to do things differently. And if we have time, we'll talk about that at the end. And so as a way of why do we call this reserve modes or assured reserve modes? Reserve modes are something that comes out of the DoD, out of the military. They're basically military capabilities and configurations held in reserve for wartime or emergency use. So the one example that a lot of people think about is the military trains on different radio frequencies than it would actually fight a war on. And the reason why you do that is you say they're held in reserve and you only use them when you need them, because if the enemy doesn't know what frequencies you're using on your radios, they're much harder to be prepared to jam them or to intercept your communications. And so we like this notion of reserve modes, and we ask the question, what would cyber reserve modes look like? And the one aspect that came up is we don't just need reserve modes, we need assured reserve modes. It doesn't make sense to have a reserve mode unless you have some high confidence that these reserve modes can't be compromised. And again, this drives you into that need for an SEL4 type based system. And what we chose to go with was Crichton's Chaos version of how they implemented the SEL4, because that has a number of other advantages that I'll let Ihor talk about. And this is basically saying that if you're going to do this and you look at the stack where you have SEL4 right above the hardware, you have what Crichton does with the Chaos operating system to SEL4, and then you have some of the services that are provided by the ARMA technology that we're developing at INL, that really has to be a trusted code base. And it has to, in some sense, ideally be formally proven, but it's something that has to give the assurance you need that these reserve modes are there and you can count on them when you need them. I think you've seen the Fisher technique in the back. It is an example of an industrial control system, and it's actually run by a Siemens PLC. And this is a video that Ihor made, and it basically shows what it does. It manufactures these various color pucks. I'll just let this run for a minute if you haven't seen it. And I'll say that it does basically present the same type of sensor and actuator signals that you would see in a real manufacturing plant. So it really is a very good experimental platform to develop this technology on. This slide is to me probably the important slide here. It's the way we try to capture what are these assured reserve modes about. And you can see there's two axes. The bottom axis, the horizontal axis, is something we're calling roll. And here we're just having two categories, one called operations. Basically, that lower left-hand box is what you think of an industrial system as doing what it should be doing, which in the case of the Fisher technique is manufacturing these orange pucks. Okay? The manufacturing process entirely runs just by the software and what's in that bottom box to do the operations. And that's why if you look on the vertical axis where we call state of the mode, you can think of them as being active or dormant. And in this case, if you're manufacturing, you're doing the business that you were designed for. If you think about the one I talked about earlier in the motivation as being a monitor, we would put that into a protection box, and we would also put that into the box as being active, because in general, you want to be monitoring what your system is doing to find out that something bad could happen. The one that Ihor is going to talk about is more of a guard that's presented for brownfields that you would put in front of the system to protect it from what could come over the internet. And the way we presented these is we presented some of the protection as not necessarily be, or not in the motivation that we talked about, the protection was a different authority. And this was motivated by, again, the fact that INL has this Cyber Sentry program where we're asked to come in and we're asked to be present in some cyber physical system in a way that right now is enabled through a data diode. But you need to have ways of thinking that there are going to be different authorities that will be on the same hardware and will have some way of having to interact with one another. As two examples of dormant type reserve modes, you could think of one of the protection reserve modes as being a hunt reserve mode. And a hunt means basically you think that your system has been infiltrated by an adversary and you're trying to find that adversary. Right now, that's largely done by looking through logs. But the other thing that's important about hunt is it's a very specialized skill. And a lot of times it takes very specialized tools. And so it's not realistically to think that everyone can do the hunt exercise. And this is a way of being able to bring in another authority that's expertise at hunting and can work on your system, but still have some degree of being isolated. Software updates are also important. I'm going to turn it over to Ihor now, but we want to talk about protecting infrastructure. And what's important to understand about brownfields is that the infrastructure lasts for decades, and it doesn't get a lot of technology refresh necessarily. And people decided that it was a good idea to hook it up to the internet. Okay? And so it's just a very ripe area for cyber attack.